We're grateful today to welcome Tanya Ruka and Rudo Kemper from Native Land Digital to give our 2022 keynote presentation titled Our Home on Native Land, Connecting People and Stories Using Indigenous Geographies. Tanya Ruka is a Māori Indigenous artist and designer who I believe is joining us today from Aotearoa, or New Zealand. Tanya is affiliated with the Ngati Pakau Ngapuhi tribal nation and is the Community Relationship Specialist for Native Land Digital. Tanya works with Mātauranga Māori, ancestral knowledge and navigational tools to design pathways of transitional Indigenous futures and Indigenous speculative design. Working in the digital realm, creating stories that firmly place Indigenous concepts, knowledge, perspectives, and ways of being in the landless territories of new imagined futures. She is currently working with dedicated Indigenous and non-Indigenous textile researchers, academics, scientists, engineers, growers, and local iwi tribes, documenting the journey to develop circular designed native plant fiber materials and textiles that will help to connect people back to the land through Indigenous ways of knowing. Tanya is joined today by Rudo Kemper, the Interim Director of Technology and Research for Native Land Digital. Rudo is a non-native geographer and technologist working in solidarity with Indigenous and other local communities to co-create and use digital tools for self-determination and self-representation. He got his start working with communities in the Amazon rainforest in the early 2010s, where he accompanied communities like the Mātauranga Maroons of Suriname in mapping and monitoring their ancestral lands and documenting their traditional knowledge and oral histories. Rudo currently works with Digital Democracy, where he is accompanying communities across the globe in building and using mapping tools to defend their lands and stewarding the development of the Earth Defenders Toolkit, a collaborative digital platform for Earth Defender communities and their allies. Originally from Curacao, Rudo has worked with communities in Suriname, Kenya, Canada, Brazil, Ecuador, Colombia, Costa Rica, and the United States. Thank you both so much for joining us today, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Hey, kia ora koutou. Thank you so much for inviting us to speak with you today. Just a short disclaimer, we have unfortunately COVID for the second time in our house. So I've been up all night with my daughter, so I'm a little bit croaky. So I've got some lemon and honey drink beside me here. Hopefully I won't croak too much. So here we go. As an Indigenous person, I locate to the land through pepeha. This is my pepeha, ko puhanga tohoro te maunga, ko wairua te awa, ko ngā tukimata whaurua te waka, ko ngā apuhi te iwi, ko Ngati Pakau te hapu, ko mahuri te marae, ko te Miringa te Rorarangi te ingoa. So this is what gives me the right to speak to the land in Aotearoa, from where I'm from in the Hokianga, which is the far North Island. Through whakapapa, we connect with our genealogies back to the land. So our knowledge keepers can trace our ancestry right back to the original atua, the Ranginui, and who is the Sky Father, and Papatūānuku, Mother Earth. And this is how we belong and related to the land. This is our kinship. So our Mātauranga Māori connects us. That's our knowledge. And our genealogy is the way that we trace back through the generations to the land. In my pepeha, I mentioned our maunga. My auntie spoke to me about our maunga, our mountain, and we connect there because our ancestors were actually taken there after they died, were taken to the maunga and to the caves, and they'd be wrapped and bound the bodies. And as the body decays, it becomes the dust of the mountain, and that's how we can be related to the mountain. So for me, that was one of those aha moments when relearning our histories and our knowledge. And, you know, because you hear, oh, you're related to a mountain, you sort of think, okay, auntie, that's great. But learning all of these facts is how I've come to understand, you know, these stories are actually very real, and they're very real for us today and can be in the future. Another little story. This here is the Kapehu Whetu, which is the Māori star compass. This is our Master Navigator's way of crossing Oceania. So this is very ancestral knowledge. It divides 360 degrees around the canoe in the open ocean. So we were able to, our ancestors were able to navigate day and night, and the Master Navigator wouldn't sleep until they got their people safely back to the land. So they used the sun, the moon, and the stars, which is the Whānui Marama, which is the family of light, again, back to genealogies, and how they map across the ocean. So they'd also use seasonal notifiers, such as certain birds would appear in the sky at certain times of the year, which would mean it's safe to go. The navigator is, of course, using these observations and migrational patterns and patterns of the ocean to get them safely back to the land. So when speaking my pepeha, I mentioned ko ngā toki matawhaurua, which is our waka, and that waka was manned by Chief Nukutawhiti, and that's a very ancient ancestor who was one of the first to cross the ocean over to Aotearoa from Hawaii and over by Hawaii and through to Raiatea, where our main marae was. So during my research, I became really interested in these ideas of observation and connection to the land and bringing everyone safely with them. It was a community effort, you know, not the I, but the we. So using these ideas, I'm thinking about ways that we can transition forward with environmental issues that we have on the land. And that's how I got to the research that I'm working on with the plant fiber technology and how we can relearn our ancestral knowledge to move forward into the future. And so a quick backstory of how I came to Native Land Digital. In 2014, I took a Māori GIS course here in Te Whānganui-a-Tara, which is Wellington, the city, main capital city of Aotearoa. And we were learning how to document and record our sacred knowledge for our tribe and our environmental claims to try and protect our rivers that you've probably heard about. Our rivers are very polluted with agricultural runoff. This image here is one of our very sacred rivers, which is running from the Southern Alps and comes out to the ocean. So through this river, every step of the way of the genealogy of water is documented. And so this is part of my documentation. And they actually wanted to put a hydro dam on this river. So we were able to work with the genealogies to state a claim to this river. We know we don't own the river is an entity in itself, but in order to protect this river, we brought in our genealogies, and we actually won this one. This one has been protected, but some of the other rivers further down haven't been. But you can see that it's beautiful. In the daylight, it's this beautiful aqua color. So it would have been such a shame to destroy it. And for Native Land Digital, I'm telling you the story because as Indigenous researchers, this is part of our story together. We all have stories like this, and we're very aware of the connection and the knowledge systems that are so sacred to each tribe in every different territory. So coming around to Native Land Digital. If you didn't know, it's available on a website or a mobile app, and it offers information on Indigenous territories in almost 30 countries, representing thousands of Indigenous groups. Native Land directly addresses the issues of marginalization and a lack of Indigenous knowledge, histories, and the ways we can do this by interactive maps, making them publicly available. And it's our goal to challenge and shift long-standing colonial narratives about Indigenous peoples, knowledge, and territories. For Native Land Digital, what we're mapping is more than just the flat surface or the flat picture or the coordinates. It's the land itself that is sacred. And we know it's not easy to draw lines that divide up into chunks these territories that are our land, our bodies. And so in reality, we know that it's something that it could be exploited. We know that it's not owned by anyone. It's an honored treasure. So these complexities of history, the kind of mapping that we're undertaking is a really important exercise. It brings awareness to the real lived history of Indigenous peoples, the nations in the long era of colonialism. So land is something that is sacred to all of us, and it's ever changing, it's ever shifting, and it's giving us and the creatures and beings on the earth an infinite number of gifts and lessons. And we aim to improve the relationship of people, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, with the land around them, with the real histories, the real sacredness. This involves acknowledging and righting the wrongs of history to the best of our capabilities, and also involves a personal journey through the importance of connecting with the earth. So while we make a strong effort to teach about colonization and to bring forth Indigenous narratives, we also strive to integrate what is sometimes called an Indigenous way of knowing. And when it comes to the importance and the sacredness of the land in our daily lives, we hope to inspire people to gain a better understanding of themselves, their ancestors, and the world they live in, so that they can move forward into a better future. And so we have a small bit of history of native land. The organisation itself began in the winter of 2014 in Vancouver, British Columbia, when founder Victor Temprano, a non-Indigenous person, began to consider how deeply the people's history of the landscapes in British Columbia were affected. And in response, he created this digital platform that mapped Indigenous territories, languages, and place names beginning in North America and increasingly the world. And I think he's done a great job.
Sorry, Tanya.
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. We had a question from the audience. If you were able to make your slides full screen. We're seeing them kind of in your browser.
Oh.
And if not, that's okay too.
Just trying.
Someone just said, just press F11. There you go. That's perfect. Thank you.
Is that better?
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay. Now, right. So Victor quickly understood that he needed help from Indigenous communities. And so by 2020, the Native Land Digital is a registered Canadian nonprofit, and it's governed by an Indigenous board of directors. It's led by an Indigenous executive director in coordination with the founder, and is supported by a non-Indigenous advisory council. And by 2021, Native Land Digital is growing in team members. There were 2 research team members came on board. That's when I came on, and 2 communications, plus many more volunteers. So when we're working in the research team, the concept of territory is, as I've said, is really important for us. So the land is inherently spiritual, and it's the basis for our ways of being and our ways of knowing. Land is not only a space for living or a provider of sustenance, but is also a basis for ceremony. It's a source of stories. It's about how to live in a respectful and responsible relationship with all living beings, and a way to connect with a deeper understanding of the responsibilities we have for the next 7 generations. Through technology, Native Land has an opportunity to bring the spiritual, existential understanding and meaning of land which goes far beyond property boundaries and discussions of history to all users. Our challenge now is to find ways to use technology to do this while improving the consciousness of our relationship to the land on which we live. So in 2021, as research communications lead, when I came on board, hearing all the feedback from the Indigenous nations and members of the community, I realized that there was the general feedback was very positive, and tribal nations wanted to be seen and heard. Native Land Digital is a platform that allows those who've been erased and disregarded and hidden by colonization to be seen. And this is feedback that I constantly hear. Most importantly, Indigenous peoples do not want to be seen as victims of the past. And this is an opportunity for Native Land Digital to acknowledge the core of Indigenous connection to the land by activating a digital space to enhance and enrich strength in our connection to each other. And that's something that I've gained from this position, is just a feeling of strength that's come through our Indigenous nations, especially at this time of COVID. You hear so many stories about everyone struggling, but the thing is that our tribal nations are together in communities working through these issues and going back to ancestral knowledge to do it. And just seeing that on a global scale is really empowering. So by 2020, we expanded the role as developing whanaungatanga, which in Māori is actively building relationships. So when you're building relationships, you're increasing the mana, or the respect between each other. And so we wanted to do this by navigating a simple pathway which connects networks and global Indigenous nations. And we wanted to do this by opening up that digital space for communications between Indigenous nations from across the globe. So being able to interact with each other and have conversations and say, what are you doing? How are you doing this? What we're doing, which is empowering, I think, by being able to speak to each other. So as a team, we're developing a framework for an Indigenous research methodology. You'll see a bit further on in the talk, we're open sourced information, so not solely academic. We answer to and listen to our Indigenous tribal communities first and foremost. We understand that we're in a very unique situation by doing this. We've become sort of kaitiaki, which in Māori is the guardians of this information and knowledge. It's like this, we're holding the spirit and the life force of Indigenous nations and stories. So we take that, that responsibility seriously. And so I'll leave you here for a bit and pass the mic over to Rudo. And these are some of the numbers that we have at the moment. And shall I stop my screen share so you can share your screen, or?
Yeah, that'd be fine. And I'll actually pick up from there and just make sure that it's looking okay. If anybody can give feedback towards that end of my full screen, Josh.
Can you press F11? It looks like it's full screen, but let's see. I'm still seeing the top of your, yeah, there you go. Perfect.
Oh, is that better? Okay, cool. Let me switch to that. Okay, great. Well, first of all, would like to echo what Tanya said, and gratitude for being invited to be here today to share with you a little bit about Native Land. Just reflecting on this slide here, that the last time that this presentation was given was, I think, last year in 2021. We had 400,000 visitors on Indigenous Peoples Day. That is now bumped to 900,000, which is exciting and also intimidating for those of us that work on the technology side. We actually used to have a slide here following this with like a 404 not found screen, because we used to have a lot more kind of difficulties on the technology side whenever Native Land, the website, went viral and subsequently would crash. We're in much better shape nowadays, but we've experienced a lot of growth and interest, and that's been just tremendously exciting. So
sorry, Rudo,
yeah.
I'm really sorry. I think we're out in the edit mode now. Maybe you can hit the slideshow button.
Okay, yeah, sorry about that. How's that?
We're still seeing it in like Google Google Slides.
Okay, I think I have to present it.
That looks good. That looks good.
Okay,
Yes.
great.
Thanks.
Sorry about the technical difficulties there. Great, yeah, so what I'd like to do a little bit of is just share with you how native land works. You're probably already to some extent familiar with native land, probably from the front end, just like the map, which I think is very visible. But there's also some processes that people aren't really aware of in terms of what happens on the back end, both from a technical side, as well as just our process and how we actually go about updating the map. And I'd like to follow that by sharing with you what you could do with native land. So knowing that this is kind of an audience of cartographers and geographers and general map folk, would like to talk about some of the applications of how you can actually use native land in your own maps and applications and what some other folks have done to leave you with some inspiration. So most people are quite familiar with the website Native Land. And this is the first thing that you'll see. And this is what's been represented about native land the most. I think as Tanya said, there's other aspects of it, including research and outreach and the kind of community building part of it that isn't quite as visible yet. We're hoping to improve on that. But there's Native Land, the website. And also, as Tanya mentioned, and folks actually, a lot of folks don't actually know about this, that we do have an application on both Android as well as on iPhone. So the application can be downloaded. We put a lot of effort into ensuring that we're cross-platform compatible. So you can actually use this on your phone as well. And some people have used that. I'm actually going to switch now to a live website demo. So Josh, if you don't mind one more time confirming that this is looking good.
I can see it. It is kind of stretched horizontally, but I'm seeing the website.
Is this better?
That's better. Yep.
Yeah, I have
Thank you.
Wide monitor. So great. Just a little tour. So we always start with a disclaimer whenever anybody opens the website, because I think a lot of people have different understandings of what this map is supposed to be, what it's supposed to represent. And we always want to first and foremost give a disclaimer that it's like a constant work in progress and that it's not by any means official or formal. These aren't definitive boundaries. There's other kind of web resources like that available if you're interested in, for example, reserve boundaries or concessions and things like that. Sessions rather, those exist elsewhere. And this is more of a kind of atemporal representation of indigenous relationships to land. And it's a constant work in progress. And what Tanya and others on our team do is quite a bit of kind of fixing of the map as we continue to hear from communities and get their input on what this map should look like. So there's a ton of community engagement that goes into updating this. I think a lot of folks are familiar that we started, of course, as Tanya mentioned also in the presentation, in North America, specifically in Canada and the United States. But in recent years, we've done quite a lot of work in South America. Some of our team has been really active here, and it's been really impressive to see how the map has been growing with a lot of knowledge from South America, which we're really excited about. Increasingly starting to do a bit more work in other parts of the world. Questions of indigeneity are complicated in different parts of the world. And so it requires us to really do our homework and ensuring that we have a consistent methodology, as Tanya mentioned. So that's something that we're working on. But as we start to hear more from communities, for example, in Africa, that are indigenous in the African continent, we're starting to responsibly adding more areas here and there, as well as a little bit in Europe and in Asia and Pacific region and elsewhere. So the map is constantly updating, and it's really exciting to see it grow quite a bit. And we're looking forward to more engagement from other parts of the world. In case you haven't explored this, there's territories, which is kind of, again, indigenous lands. But we also have a couple of other layers for languages. So if you're interested in different indigenous language groups, as well as treaties where that is relevant, certainly in the case of North America and in New Zealand, Aotearoa as well. So we do have a couple of different data sets, and there's some additional, mapping functionality that you can use to kind of explore this. And one fun thing you can do is, of course, look up where you live or an area where you're interested in. So in my case, I'm originally from a very small island in the Caribbean called Curacao. And when I search Curacao, I get these, first of all, it zooms in and it kind of highlights for you which areas are intersecting with those. And this is a very common usage of the map that a lot of people have gotten quite some leverage with when it comes to doing things like land acknowledgements, where I do have to say that we have a whole guide as well about land acknowledgements and some thoughts on how to go beyond just doing a land acknowledgement, which is a whole topic in and of itself. But in terms of the map, right, it kind of surfaces which communities are intersecting with those. And something not a lot of people know is that there's actually dedicated pages for each of these communities areas as well. And there's quite a lot of information that you can find here, and some are much more active than others. In this case, I'm picking Taino because it intersects with Curacao. And what we have here is different websites that might be associated with that community, related maps. There's kind of a repository of different maps that were used as ways to draw the kind of maps that you see on the map. So it's also a way for you to find historical maps, and also for you to see how our team is doing the work in terms of actually adding the areas. Some sources, as well as a change log. So anytime a change is made to the map, and you can see here the Taino area has been updated quite a few times since it was first added. So there's quite a lot of information here, and we're actually looking forward in the future to expanding this all the more, and also finding ways that communities themselves can be involved in controlling the information that goes on here and updating it so it doesn't have to go through this kind of corrections form, which is currently how we are intaking information from the community in terms of adding new sources or making corrections. So on that note, just going back to the presentation here and hoping that it shows. Yeah, so a little bit about kind of our process, right? This is an interesting part that I think we put a lot of work into, and we haven't done a lot of storytelling around the kind of how this all works. So when we do get some information submitted, we actually have like a fairly complicated, well, not complicated, sophisticated, I should say, system in which we are kind of handling this and triaging, and where the research team led by Tanya is making constant fixes and starting discussions about different emails that we get, right? So here's a kind of an example from the Taino context where somebody actually submitted, some resources to be added to the site. So whenever that happens, this actually gets logged in a software called Jira that you might be familiar with, kind of a product management software. And that's actually where our research team is constantly kind of commenting back and forth and updating each other on how this is done and how these changes are made. So this is kind of on the back end, and our research team puts a tremendous amount of time actually into really responsibly kind of handling all of the many emails that we get from community members or other folks that are submitting information. So this is kind of what happens behind the scenes that nobody knows about, that is actually, to me, super impressive, and something that really speaks, I think, to Native Land as an organization that's really values driven and ensuring that we are serving community members and honoring and respecting all of the different inputs that we are getting. There's actually a map interface as well that our founder, Victor Temprano, built for Jira, which actually also maps the different sort of intake of feedback and input that we get on a map. So there's also a map interface for being able to kind of visualize in a geographic way where all of the different changes and submissions are taking place. Tanya, I was curious if you wanted to maybe share a story of an example of a more recent kind of, just to demonstrate how this all works in terms of, getting input from the community and how the map gets adjusted.
Yes, I had a quick look through, and just a couple of most recent ones. We have an email from one of the nation members, and it says, "Hi there, I'm a lands manager for Kanakwa Band in BC, Canada. How can we get recognized on your website?" And we hear this a lot, sort of, "We're here, we're not invisible. Here's our information." And they've also sent through a map of the territory for further information about the community. It's also available elsewhere, and they'll send us links as well. And then I've responded back and thanked them very much for the information and the resources. And always they're so grateful that we're listening, and they've sent through another response that says, "Thank you for your prompt response. Just to clarify, the community and the name and the language and the shape files as well." So they've sent us through the shape files that we can then send through, and they can adjust the polygons on the map and the territory. And the comeback is, "Thanks, Tanya. It's exciting to see this up." So it's always exciting, and most of the time, I mean, sometimes there's negative efforts because as Indigenous people, we've been pushed out of our own territories in a lot of these places. So there are a buildup of iwi or tribal nations. And then that's where we start the layering process. So as you can see, the territories in a layered format, so that everyone's voice can be heard, because that's what the most important thing is, I feel, is that everyone's voice is heard. I come from an Indigenous nation where the same thing has happened. We've merged with a bigger tribal nation. So that causes problems, because then you say, well, I'm this, and they're saying, we're this, we're here. This is our space, our territory, especially when there are resources involved. And that's where we kind of forget as Indigenous peoples that our land is not a resource. It's not the word that we use. So all these conversations, uncomfortable as they may be, are conversations that need to be had in order to build that strength so that we can all be heard and feel seen. And I think that's what's so important. I've got a few more, many more of that feedback as well.
Yeah, and there's so many that we get, which is like, as we start to grow more and more, right, and the visibility increases, we get increasing outreach. Again, both initially potentially positive, potentially negative, but always, you know, hoping to like amplify what's happening on the ground. And our team does a tremendous amount of work, I think, which is really amazing in kind of engaging and really taking the time to respond and ensure that people feel heard, right, and that visibility is ensured. Thanks, Tanya, for sharing that. So a little bit about the kind of the mapping end, right? This is also kind of interesting in terms of how this works. So again, our founder, Victor Temprano, actually builds, so first of all, the website is in WordPress. Some of you might know WordPress, a content management system. And our founder actually built a tool for doing the mapping directly into WordPress so that it doesn't require a lot of technical expertise in order to actually draw some of the areas. And you could, you know, certainly upload GeoJSON, KML, or shapefile and things like that as well, but you can also directly draw on the map itself. And that's often done by some of our research team. So that actually takes place on WordPress. And then it actually gets fed into different areas that you might be familiar with, like Mapbox, which actually then renders the map. So some of the actual activity that takes place. So after that research that we talked about, you know, somebody from the research team will go in here and kind of adapt this page, and there's actually more to it as well. You know, if you scroll down on this page, you'll get the sources and links and all the things that I showed earlier. But there's actually a map interface, which is Mapbox built with, and also MapLibre now built with WordPress, which is kind of exciting. So we have an API, right? And this is actually one of the most interesting ways, I think, that people can also engage with native land if you're a cartographer or somebody building an application, because there's the sort of front end that most people are familiar with. But there's also an API where you can do your own queries in order to curate your own data or to provide native land data as a service for any of your own maps, no matter what platform they're in. And I'll talk a little bit in a second about ArcGIS and Mapbox and the different options that you have available, or for any kind of web interface or application, right? So we have a pretty well-documented API. This is, I think, in the resources section. So if you go to nativelands.ca and you go into resources and API, there's a lot of information here on how to actually do queries and serve this for the different kind of applications or maps that you might want to produce. Depending on who you are, this is either like very familiar or very scary. This is like the GeoJSON that you actually get from native land. And so this is like a ton of spatial data in which you have embedded all of the territories, the names, some of the links and sources that you could utilize. And this is the kind of thing that you can integrate into your maps. This is, I think, generated once daily. So as updates are made, the GeoJSON actually gets updated as well. And so if you have this pointing to one of our endpoints, to get a little technical for a second, this would update as well, right? So if you have this integrated into an app, you can just point to the endpoint or in a map, right? And it would pull the latest data from native land. So it's actually a really valuable source that you could utilize for any maps and data. On the Mapbox end, for the cartographers in the room, there's actually a tile set that Mapbox makes available publicly and for free, which you can utilize in your own maps. So any kind of Mapbox product, whether it's their story map template or any maps that you're producing or apps that you're building, you could actually integrate this as one of your layers on anything that has to do with Mapbox. So this is an example that I actually built with Digital Democracy, where I also work. We made a little story map kind of going through the history of digital democracy and some of our kind of project areas and communities that we've worked with. And what you see in the background there is a bunch of the place names, right? And these are actually the names of territories from native land. So that's one thing you can do as well, of course, is you could use the polygons that are on the map, or you can use the place names as well, or rather the indigenous community names as a way to kind of shed some light or add an interesting data layer to something you might be doing. I think this can be really effective when done right? Like, even if it's a map that doesn't have to do with indigenous territory per se, by having this as a data layer, you're again bringing that visibility, right, of the communities that are still present and have relationships to the land. And just having that being part of your map could be something really compelling and powerful. Again, even if your map isn't necessarily about indigenous land claims or territory. We are also working on, for the Esri users, no doubt there are some in the room, a workflow to get some of the native lands data into ArcGIS. So we're actually working on including this into the Living Atlas so that you can actually draw this into your maps, whether online in ArcGIS Online or on your desktop directly. But in the meantime, we do have a workflow that's documented. It basically involves a few steps where you take that GeoJSON that I showed earlier and basically integrate it into ArcGIS, either online or desktop. And so somebody has worked on a story map, which I could share the link with that later, where you can follow that workflow along. So if you're not familiar with how to work with GeoJSON data, somebody has taken the time to kind of document all of that, so you don't have to be super technical to know how to use that. But that said, soon we hope to have it in Living Atlas as well. So at that point, it'll be a lot easier to even integrate it with just a one click. This is an example of an ArcGIS tool that was built with native land. So we have a partnership with the National Trail System in the United States and the Bureau of Land Management, where we have collectively sponsored a Hopi cartographer by the name of Kiana, who is actually working on adding indigenous knowledge to the National Trail System in the United States, which is really exciting. So Kiana has been doing a ton of work on the research side as well as in mapping to document different interesting sort of stories or things that people should know as they traverse these trails. I mean, some are more well documented than others, like, you know, the Trail of Tears and things like that, but also different trails that, you know, don't have any direct relationship with indigenous history, but were once traversed or set out by indigenous communities. And a lot of people don't know that. So adding this kind of knowledge is a really powerful way of, again, bringing that visibility to indigenous tenure and history in the United States in this context. And so Kiana's working on a really exciting project that's culminating at this year, at the end of this year rather, sort of documenting a lot of that knowledge and providing that back to the National Trail System and Bureau of Land Management, and then also overlaying that with some of the native land data, as you can see here. So it's a really exciting map project that Kiana's working on. Just a couple of other examples, just some ideas and different things that people have used native land for. So this is a website called Whose Land, which is actually fairly similar to native land in terms of what it does. It feeds kind of a map where you have some of the native lands data, but you can also juxtapose that with, for example, the presence of residential schools in Turtle Island, North America, as well as territories by city. So they basically use the API to curate a similar but different product as to native land. And I think they call directly from our API as well. So this is, I think, one of the first cases where somebody implemented native land for not only a map, but an entire application that kind of wraps around a map. Another example is this land acknowledgement. This, I think, happened last year, where a team from Code for Anchorage in Alaska ended up building a couple of different tools, including a text messaging service where you could actually send, I believe it is your city or zip code, into a text messenger, and it'll actually give you back the different community areas that are intersecting with that. There's also a Facebook Messenger bot that they built. So they've done all kinds of creative ways of figuring out ways to feed this information to people. This happened last year, and I think it's still an active project. Entirely open source, as much like our product in Stack is, and calling from our API. And another quite interesting example is the Canadian Encyclopedia, which for all of their different indigenous areas or articles on the website, there's also a map which is pulling from native land. And there's actually a lot of examples like this. And I don't think even as a team, we have a sense of how many there are, because the API is relatively easy to use. And sometimes people reach out to us to say, like, hey, we did this. We built this wonderful tool using your API. Thank you. In other cases, there's a little bit of support that's needed, and that's fine, and that's why we're here. But we don't actually have a sense of the number of museums and universities and just different institutions that are using native land in creative ways, even if it's just sourcing the data when it comes to providing information. I was actually just in a museum in DC yesterday, or rather not a museum, but the library, Martin Luther King Library, where they have an exhibition on the city. And there was actually a little plaque there which had some information about the different communities, whose presence is in the DC area. And I expected that information, that in this case, they didn't say native land, but I expect that it might have been sourced. And there's many examples like that, where different exhibitions just, give us credit, which is really exciting. And yeah, we don't know how many examples like that are out here, but here's, I think, a really interesting one. And then just lastly, like a pretty sophisticated application called FieldKit, which is actually, I think, a environmental kind of measurement tool that a team is building for doing things like water quality measurement or getting readings on air quality or temperature, weather. They have made a small but meaningful inclusion of native land as well, where for any data that's collected, they have a web portal, a user interface, which shows the locations of, where the data was collected. And they also have a small inclusion of, the native lands that it intersects with, which is, I think, a really nice example of showing how, again, like you could use this data, and even if your project is not about native lands, there's still ways that you can render visibility to native lands in those projects. So really kind of exciting example there. So native land, as Tanya mentioned, right? So we're an organization and there's a team, but we also are eager to collaborate with people. And we do have a volunteer coordinator that we hired last year, who kind of helps onboard people, because a lot of people come to us and say, hey, I love this project. I would love to help. How can I do that? And there's different kinds of needs that we have, right? So on the technology side, there's like building the tools and testing out the applications and so on. There's providing information, there's doing research, there's giving us maps, things like that, but also potentially generating blogs. Like, for example, if anybody's used native land, we would love to feature that and kind of tell the story of how people are actually engaging with the platform. So there's actually a ton of different areas, as you can see here, and we're eager to kind of work with anybody that has ideas or that would like to get involved in something. Right now, we are going through a bit of a transition period where we are looking to restructure some of our teams on the technology side and on the executive side. But if you're interested in getting involved with native land, we would love to talk with you, and we would love to see how, we can continue to create this resource as a community. Just briefly on the technology side, so we just launched our GitHub. We have had a GitHub, it's been private, so now it's public, and I'm in the process of sort of building some of our repositories on there, because we are very much open source leaning in our approach, as Tanya mentioned, when it comes to something like research, but also technology, where we would love to have more folks collaborating with us on this. There's lots and lots of needs and ways and ideas that we have for native land and how to keep expanding this. And we're super eager to actually turn this into a bit of a more open source process, where if you are a technologist or a geographer and you would like to get involved in helping us make this an even stronger and more impactful resource, would love to talk with you. And soon there will be more content on our GitHub, but for the time being, if you are interested in somehow contributing, you can reach out to us, and I'm happy to get you onboarded. And I think now I would like to pass it back to Tanya for this final part. And Tanya, I'm happy to, I'm happy to keep sharing. Cool.
Okay, so what's coming up? We've, I think the Patreon page is already live, and we're hiring a new executive director. We've got an Indigenous languages translation. We're hoping to add audio to each nation territory page of the way that you say the territory name. I often struggle when I'm communicating with tribal members, you don't know how to pronounce, like even my Māori names and words are very complex, and the sounds are very different to what you read. So I think that'll be a really good way to help share and communicate our languages and keep them out there in the world. We're hoping to include more blog posts and community-driven content. So we're looking forward to opening up the territory pages where the tribal nations can actually adjust and maintain them themselves and share information that's happening within their communities. So we're also hopefully soon publishing an open research methodology that I was talking about, where we're actually sharing our questions that we have and getting feedback from our community and thinking about things, because there are Indigenous nations in surprising places, and you're thinking about, so what does Indigenous mean? And then we're also hoping to have more regular newsletters, and we're also working on expanding into Africa, Asia, and Europe. So a lot of work. So I'll just sum it up. How can we get better? We're looking to strengthen Indigenous engagement, which means that we'll be connecting in with as many tribal members as we can, from our point of view. We're hoping to improve the storytelling content, so that's the opening up of the pages. We're, as Udo said, we're hoping for a more collaborative environment. We're increasing our responsiveness to inquiries and corrections. But as we said, it's a very difficult process when we deep dive into that research. So we're also helping for better education surrounding the aim and methodology of Native Land Digital. And we're always open to suggestions. Open forums. So we're doing this by developing further with our whanaungatanga and building those connective relationships. And that's our strategy there. Our hope is to create a living map, so it's alive with the stories and voices and imagery of the people and communities that are on there. And that autonomy, hopefully, will be able to show the give and take and the transparency of our processes. And we're looking forward to becoming a more Indigenous focused map. And that's how we hope to do it. So thank you very much. Rudo?
Yeah, no, that's the end of, I think, our what we had to share today. So we'd love to maybe have a conversation and see if folks have ideas and thoughts and can make this a little bit more, dialogical.
Yeah, thank you both so much for sharing this amazing work. We had and just I'll remind everybody, if you have questions, please pop them in the Q&A feature. We did have one question that came in, and Rudo, I saw you typed an answer to it, but maybe for the other folks, we can just quickly chat about that. The question was essentially, would Native Land be able to support student interns, independent study, or even potentially course-related assignments to help with feature development?
Yeah, so the answer is absolutely. This is something we've done before when it comes to engaging with classes from the non-technical side. But from the technical side as well, I think there's a lot of opportunities for students or junior developers or mappers to get involved. There's lots that can be done, and depending on what they're interested in, it may not be very tricky to onboard in terms of getting them set up with a development environment or giving them some tasks to work on. So we are very much open to that. Please just let us know what you're thinking. Feel free to reach out to me or anybody from the team, and yeah, would love to chat about that.
And there's another question that or sort of comment that just came in that highlights the audience today is primarily an academic audience, and so thinking about ways of engaging both Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. And I know at one time on the resources page for the site, you had kind of a teacher's guide. And I was wondering if you maybe could share some examples that if you know about, ways that educators have incorporated this resource, or the kinds of ways that you might envision educators incorporating this resource, increasing visibility, but also leading to that engagement.
Yeah, Tanya, I don't know if you maybe have more, if you want to take this one.
I've actually heard back from quite a few teachers who are using the education resource on the website. And what the usual pattern is to zoom in on their territory first, and then start from the very basics. So you're looking at where you are, and what tribal nations are on that territory. And then and from that part, they can then zoom to the links and the resources that are listed below, and they take students through and get them to do their own research, really, because Native Land Digital is a really great starting point for finding the territories and the nations, and then they allow the students to then find their own interests in the different tribal nations and allow them to do that deep dive. But yeah, Native Land Digital is a very good place to start. Also, if you come up against any territories where there isn't links and resources, but you're in that territory, and you know, we're always really grateful to receive them non-indigenous as well, because that's how we're growing the education resources as well, with feedback from people. And as education as well, we also hear from a lot of people who are part of Indigenous nations, but are very far away from them, and they haven't been able to connect in with their nations. So they're learning about their nations from Native Land Digital as well, and they're always really grateful.
Yeah, just to add that I've added the teacher's guide link, which is still on the website, and it's something that some of our team and our board member Sean has put a lot of thought into, with a lot of really practical examples on how to use native land in a classroom setting for different levels. So for anyone that's interested, there's a link there in the chat.
Yeah, and then there was another comment that came in just about, like, many of us in our positions have hosted like mapathons to educate humanitarian mapathons through the OpenStreetMap team. And so there's just a comment that seems like potentially a neat possibility for engaging students with this resource as well. And then we have another question. Have you had any conversations about how these mapping tools require users to draw boundaries, but the idea of a boundary might be antithetical to a community in trying to describe the land they belong to?
Yes, basically, we have those all the time, especially when a nation is they'll mark a boundary by tree or river, or, like I said, maunga, mountain. And that's also a part of the conversation that we always have when we're looking into the territory in a deeper way. So we need to learn where the river goes. And a lot of the time they'll also be talking about how the land of where they were harvesting was their territory, but it wasn't in their own territory. So those are conversations that we have to have on an individual, each story, each nation topic, because it's too wide. And again, those are the questions that come up for us. So that was a good question. It's hard, but conversation is the best way to work through them.
I agree. It's like a very interesting topic, even about like maps as a whole. Like, you know, something we talk about a lot is that maps themselves are kind of, we're a Western construct, and like, to what extent is it necessary to put Indigenous lands on a map, and what does that do? And, you know, the way that I come at this answer, I think each of us from native land probably has like their own perspective on this, but the way that I kind of come at this is like via like having talked about maps with a lot of communities in South America, where like to them, they don't need maps for their own internal management or their own processes or learning or, you know, traditional knowledge. Like, that's already there. It comes into play when it comes to dealing with outsiders that need to know from their point of view how to understand the land. So to them, they frame it almost as like, this is to help outsiders to understand what our land looks like from our point of view. This is to help y'all that are coming into doing kind of extractive activities and so on. So and it also gets kind of like epistemologically interesting when it comes to like representations of land, because for a lot of communities, land is much more than just space, right? It's also, there's like spiritual relationships, there's like connections to things that are not easy to represent on a map. So like, as a technologist, I think about this a lot in terms of like what's available and how can you challenge the kind of, the technological side of mapping to be more inclusive to different understandings of the world, right? And include different communities. Like cosmology, it's something really interesting to think about. And then to Tanya's point, I could really defer so much case to case basis. But broadly, I think there's like value in like visibility. And that's why a lot of communities that are really enthusiastic about native land or, you know, choose to have involvement in it, because they see the value in having that, because if not, there's nothing. And a lot of people don't even know that that community was there. And so, yeah.
Thank you. We have about 5 more minutes, and there's another question that came in. I think for you, Tanya, you were talking a little bit about sort of audio and pronunciation as part of your next steps. And this question is, do you have instances where those languages may no longer be spoken, but perhaps you still have some print examples, and how might you integrate that?
Yes, we do. We find a lot of ancestral knowledge, like I said, dates back to the original gods for us. So a lot of the languages have changed, and we actually had one just recently where they've developed their language because there are old ancestral words, and now they're using new contemporary versions. They've evolved the language, so they now call it something else. So they got in contact with us and asked if we could include that, and we actually started up a different page for that language, so it stood out on its own but was connected to the ancestral language. And we also have that here in Māori as well, where there are words that are very tapu and very sacred, and we don't really want to put them on the internet, because with that comes a lot of the spiritual wairua essence of that language. So there's contemporary versions, which is also another really interesting topic to get into, that kind of evolution of the words. I mean, because we didn't have a word for internet or computers and things like that. So it's also a great way to be able to share too with other cultures and nations, when you have words that are, you're happy about sharing and gifting together. So that's another great conversation too.
I think it was maybe on your last slide that you said one of the things you're thinking about is kind of like a more wiki style editing capabilities. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about what you're envisioning for that, and sort of who you're most trying to engage, and what you might think those contributions would be.
Yeah, I think that's a part of the development too, is that nation members will be able to add to the pages and add what's happening in their communities. And if anyone's got something that's going on the land, land back, that sort of thing, they can do that themselves and add into it. And so that's where we're having those conversations about how to access and what's put on the page, and how we navigate those conversations as well. So that's a work in progress too, which is why we're really happy to have these conversations and talk back and forward, so we can gain a better understanding and improve. Yeah,
I would add, maybe there's interesting challenges associated with that we talk about a lot, in terms of like who has access to editing that and who should have access. And there could be like differences of opinion on that even within one community. So it's given us a lot of pause to like ensure that from the technological side, it's not too bad. It's just adding like basically usernames and an ability for people to edit certain parts of the website. But from like a methodological point of view, in terms of how you do that in a responsible way, is quite tricky and can be quite tricky. And so it's something that if anybody has like thoughts and ideas on that, I would love to talk with you about that, because we'd love to make it happen. And it's like a very common request and we want that, right? We want more kind of like data sovereignty, essentially, for communities to be able to control that. But doing that in a responsible way where, on a case-by-case basis as well, it's quite tricky. So if anyone has ideas, would love to chat more about that.
Yeah, I mean, the last two questions have really made me think about sort of, we have these discussions too, almost kind of in the context of like Western intellectual property law versus, Tanya, you brought up the idea of, not necessarily putting out secret words on the internet for members outside the community to see. So there's some really interesting things in terms of like, you may be familiar with, you probably are, the Mukurtu content management system, and like traditional knowledge labels as a way of indicating and regulating access, community-based access. So I see a lot of that kind of consideration in all of the things that you're describing now.
Yeah, like one other example, because I think it'll be interesting for folks here, is we've talked a lot about place names as well, and adding place names to the map. So besides just Indigenous territories, there's like notable place names that could be added, and that in of itself could be a whole resource. But even there, you get into kind of tricky questions of what you said, intellectual property and consent, and doing that responsibly. And even if it's like already out in the public, it raises questions of, should it have already been out in the public? Just because it's leaked doesn't mean it's responsible for us to then put it on the map. So it's quite interesting. Like, there's so much potential, but we really want to make sure that we do this in a responsible way. like what our values are really to kind of serve community first and foremost in everything that we do. And then secondly, thinking of the kind of other, engagements with the resource. So it's something that we talk about quite a lot, I think, in our meetings, and are trying to think through how to do in a responsible way.
We have 1 minute left, so before we take a short break, I just wanted to give you a chance. You mentioned a Patreon site. Do you want to just maybe talk about that for a second, or show folks what you launched there? And I'll pop the link. I think you shared the link. I'll pop it in the chat too for everybody.
I'm trying to pull it up on the side here. I don't know if Tanya, maybe if you want to start.
Sorry, Tanya, you're muted.
Sorry,
I put it in the chat. Yeah, I put it in the chat for everyone. And it's the it just looks like you're sort of allowing for folks to contribute and become sort of member contributors to the project. Is that right?
That's right. It's got the levels, the monthly levels there. It's pretty standard there. But what happens is because it's a nonprofit, everything is sort of going towards funding to develop these new processes, and hopefully at some point we'll be able to really open up the pages and get some conversations going. So it's important that there's funding available for that, and that's why they've chosen to start the Patreon page to support those, and also to get more people on board, because as we were saying, the research is so complex that we're a very, very small team, our research team, and just the help is needed to really deep dive into the understandings and the ideas so we can be responsible about what we're doing. So it all goes to, and mostly an Indigenous team too. So it's really good work for us. We're finding strength and being together, and I'm honored to be working there.
Yeah, thank you both so much. This is just amazing work, and thank you for sharing it with our group today.